May 10, 1940, arrived over northern France with a quiet that belied the significance of the days to come. The town of Sedan, nestled along the Meuse River, was home to ordinary routines, small market streets, and green fields that had known the rhythms of harvest and quiet labor for decades. Soldiers moved through the area in measured steps, their boots pressing into soft soil and muddy roads. For the French army, Sedan represented both a strategic anchor and a fragile barrier. Artillery positions had been carefully established along the high ground. Observation posts occupied the riverbanks, and infantry dug foxholes while moving cautiously through fields and hedgerows. There was no spectacle, only preparation, each movement purposeful and deliberate. Letters from soldiers in the weeks leading up to the German advance describe a mixture of confidence and restrained unease. Men wrote of camaraderie, of routines that made the days seem ordinary despite the looming threat. Officers recorded observations of unusual enemy activity, distant engine sounds, and the increasing intensity of reconnaissance patrols. These details, understated in tone, captured the slow tension of a defensive position under assessment. Nothing seemed extraordinary in isolation, but together they hinted at the significance of the moments to come. The human awareness of impending challenge added a weight to their actions. Grounding the narrative in lived experience, French command relied on a combination of static defense and anticipation of enemy movement. Artillery units were deployed to cover the most likely crossing points of the Meuse, infantry positioned to protect flanks, and engineers reinforced bridges. Commanders considered the landscape carefully, noting river bends, wooded areas, and high ground that could conceal or expose troops. Communication lines were established using runners, telephones, and signal wires, yet the distance between units introduced inevitable delays. The coordination required for effective defense was meticulous, constrained by technology and terrain, and shaped by the knowledge that even small miscalculations could have outsized consequences on the German side. Intelligence and reconnaissance had identified Sedan as a pivotal point. Troop movements were carefully mapped, armored units prepared for rapid deployment, and engineers rehearsed river crossings under controlled conditions. Orders were issued with precision, emphasizing timing, coordination, and the careful sequencing of infantry, tanks, and artillery. Soldiers were conscious of their role within the larger plan, aware that discipline and execution would determine success. Diaries later reflect this quiet anticipation. The tension was measured, grounded in the certainty of preparation, and shaped by the repeated rehearsal of tactics rather than the spectacle of immediate confrontation. The Meuse River itself became a silent participant in the unfolding events. Its calm surface reflected morning light, hiding both the shallows that could support pontoon bridges and the deeper currents that complicated crossings. Soldiers on both sides observed it with caution, French defenders using it as a barrier, German engineers evaluating its potential for strategic advantage. Environmental factors: the river's flow, the softness of riverbanks after spring rains, and patches of forest along the banks added nuance to military planning. Each human decision interacted with these natural conditions, producing outcomes that would emerge only as events unfolded. Patrols and scouts on the French side moved quietly along the high ground and through hedgerows. Reports of unusual sounds or movement were logged, small reconnaissance attempts undertaken to verify suspicions. Soldiers described in letters the tension of waiting, the careful observation, and the small acts of vigilance that felt ordinary yet critical. For many, the preparation phase was marked less by the imminence of combat than by the awareness of responsibility, the need to maintain readiness, coordinate units, and anticipate enemy action within a constrained environment across the river. German units conducted their own assessments. Engineers inspected terrain for crossing viability, infantry rehearsed formations, and armored units performed logistical checks. Each step was methodical. Trucks and tanks moved along forest tracks to avoid detection, infantry maintained spacing, and communications were verified to ensure that orders would propagate without delay. Soldiers noted the weather, the terrain, and the quiet of early morning as factors that shaped their readiness. The human dimension was ever present, emphasizing that operational success depended on sustained attention, precision, and coordination rather than dramatic heroism. The first subtle signs of action began to emerge as reconnaissance and probing attacks tested French positions. Small units crossed into contested areas, observing responses and noting the location of defensive fire. French officers adjusted positions, shifting artillery and repositioning infantry in response to observations. These movements were minor in isolation, but represented the initial interface between planning and execution. Soldiers felt the tension of anticipation, the awareness that while no decisive engagement had occurred, the stakes were real, and their preparations were about to be tested. Artillery placements along the Meuse were adjusted according to terrain and intelligence. French gunners calibrated their weapons, noting the angles of observation and the potential approaches the enemy might use. Ammunition stocks were inspected and supply chains verified. Observers described a rhythm to these preparations: methodical, repetitive, and deliberate. The physical labor was intertwined with mental discipline, calculating ranges, adjusting positions, and coordinating with adjacent units, all while maintaining awareness of the broader strategic context. By midday, the atmosphere along the Meuse was defined by quiet readiness. Soldiers on both sides moved with purpose, yet the landscape remained calm, the river reflecting the sky and the surrounding fields. Engineers continued to reinforce bridges and prepare for movement. Officers coordinated units and reviewed plans, and infantry maintained positions while observing the opposite bank. The calm was not a sign of absence of tension, but of preparation, a recognition that the stage was set for events that would unfold with both inevitability and consequence. Letters and diaries later recovered described the subtle psychology of this period. Soldiers noted the ordinary acts of preparation, the attention to detail, and the awareness that these small, deliberate movements carried great significance. Officers reflected on the difficulty of maintaining morale and cohesion while anticipating action. On the German side, similar reflections emphasized focus, discipline, and the sense that success required both coordination and patience. The human dimension, the experience of individuals within larger operational frameworks, is central to understanding why Sedan became pivotal. By evening, both sides had solidified positions. French defenses along the Meuse were in place, artillery calibrated, infantry dug in, and observation posts active. German units had completed preliminary movements, secured supply lines, and finalized crossing plans. The quiet of the town and the river reflected the calm before engagement. Yet the human and strategic groundwork was complete. The stage had been set, and the inevitability of confrontation was implicit, emerging naturally from careful preparation, disciplined planning, and the accumulation of countless small actions that together determined the outcome of the coming days. Chapter 1, in essence, establishes the historical context, human experience, and environmental factors that shaped the Battle of Sedan. The audience gains a reflective understanding of preparation as both a practical and psychological process, witnessing the measured rhythm of soldiers and officers on both sides. The calm before the storm is not cinematic spectacle, but lived reality, the first steps in an inevitable progression that will unfold across the next chapters, where action, consequence, and human experience will converge along the banks of the Meuse. By the morning of May 12, 1940, the calm along the Meuse had shifted. The river, once a serene boundary, now marked the threshold of a decisive confrontation. German engineers worked quietly yet efficiently, assembling pontoon bridges under the watchful eyes of officers who understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Infantry units moved in disciplined formation, tanks positioned to provide cover, and reconnaissance teams carefully reported observations from the opposite bank. Each movement was deliberate, measured, and grounded in an understanding that the success of the crossing depended on precision and timing. French observers along the high ground watched with growing unease. Small artillery units, entrenched and camouflaged, had been positioned to cover the most probable crossing points. Forward posts transmitted intermittent reports, noting unusual movements, distant engine hums, and the subtle changes in enemy formation. Officers adjusted placements, coordinating with infantry below to reinforce vulnerable positions. The human experience here was one of constant observation and quiet anticipation, soldiers aware that each decision, each adjustment, carried real consequences, yet constrained by the limitations of terrain, distance, and communication. The German advance, methodical and unhurried, exploited natural cover along the riverbanks. Engineers placed bridging materials with care, ensuring stability and speed, while infantry units maintained spacing to reduce vulnerability. Tanks remained poised to suppress potential defensive fire, advancing only when reconnaissance confirmed relative safety. Soldiers later recounted a sense of quiet focus, the discipline of repeated preparation and rehearsal shaping both individual and collective behavior. There was no spectacle in these movements, only the inevitability of coordination meeting opportunity. As the first pontoon sections reached the river, French artillery fired sporadically. The shots were precise, intended to disrupt rather than destroy. Yet the German units adapted, adjusting positions, timing, and formation. Engineers responded with swift repairs, infantry shifted to cover the work, and tanks moved to provide suppressive fire. The human element, alertness, adaptability, and endurance was as central to the outcome as the mechanical efficiency of bridges, guns, and vehicles. Diaries from both sides emphasized the quiet tension, the mixture of fatigue and concentration, and the awareness that the river crossing was not a singular event, but a cumulative process unfolding across hours. French defensive strategy relied on observation posts and coordinated artillery fire. Officers attempted to anticipate the precise locations and methods of crossing, directing small units to cover likely approaches. Soldiers moved cautiously, checking fields of fire, adjusting positions, and maintaining communication under the stress of intermittent bombardment. The Meuse, deceptively calm, dictated the rhythm of their actions. Each decision, each repositioning, was informed by terrain, intelligence, and human judgment, highlighting the interplay of environmental and operational factors in the unfolding conflict. By midday, German infantry had begun to step onto the bridges, crossing the river in coordinated increments. Engineers reinforced sections as they became occupied, ensuring that successive waves of troops and equipment could advance without interruption. Tanks provided cover from concealed positions, moving along forested tracks parallel to the river, their presence a stabilizing factor for the crossing. Soldiers described a sense of measured momentum, each crossing contingent on the success of prior movements, each unit dependent on the precision of countless small actions executed in concert. French defenders, recognizing the threat, launched counter-battery fire and deployed small infantry units to disrupt crossings. Yet the cumulative pressure of the German operation, combined with the efficiency of their engineering and coordination, gradually eroded the effectiveness of resistance. Soldiers and officers on the French side experienced both tactical frustration and quiet resolve, aware that the river was becoming increasingly compromised. Observers noted that human endurance, adaptability, and the capacity to maintain composure under continued strain were critical factors shaping the outcome. The crossing was not a singular act of dramatic heroism, but a series of deliberate, interconnected efforts. Engineers, infantry, and tanks worked together seamlessly. Reconnaissance reported progress and setbacks. Command units adjusted instructions in real time. The human experience was subtle but profound. The awareness that each movement influenced the next, that timing, coordination, and judgment were as decisive as firepower or terrain. The narrative here emphasizes inevitability over spectacle. The crossing succeeds not because of sudden action, but because preparation meets opportunity in measured, disciplined fashion. By late afternoon, significant German forces were established. Across the Meuse, bridges had been completed, infantry held footholds, and armor was positioned to support continued inland advance. French defensive units, stretched thin, began to withdraw or regroup, their positions increasingly untenable. Under the weight of persistent, coordinated pressure, soldiers later reflected on the disorienting combination of natural beauty and human conflict. The river and fields unchanged, yet transformed by the movement of armies and the weight of consequence. The river itself, now a thoroughfare of both opportunity and hazard, had become a central character in the unfolding story. Its currents, banks, and surrounding terrain shaped every decision, every adjustment, and every casualty. The crossing illustrates the interplay between human action and environmental reality, the engineering challenges, the tactical calculations, and the psychological burden of observing or executing movement under enemy observation. These elements combine to convey the human and operational inevitability that defines this moment in history. As evening fell, the Meuse crossings were secure enough to allow continued inland movement. Engineers dismantled temporary obstructions, infantry held forward positions, and command units coordinated subsequent advances. The French army faced the immediate consequence. Defensive lines had been breached, positions compromised, and units forced into reactive maneuvers. Soldiers experienced fatigue, stress, and the quiet pressure of making decisions under constraint. Civilians, observing from nearby villages, were beginning to reckon with the intrusion of war into familiar landscapes. A reflection of the human cost beyond the battlefield, Chapter 2 captures the gradual and inevitable crossing of the Meuse, highlighting the combination of preparation, discipline, human endurance, and environmental factors that determine success. The audience sees that military outcomes are rarely the result of singular dramatic acts. Rather, they emerge from the consistent application of planning, adaptation, and observation. The stage is now set for the next chapter, where the collapse of French defenses will unfold as a direct consequence of the precision and persistence demonstrated during this crossing. The human and operational threads established here provide the foundation for understanding the cascading effects of Sedan's fall. By the third day following the crossing of the Meuse, the landscape of northern France had begun to reflect the consequences of the breakthrough. For the French army, positions that had once appeared secure now revealed vulnerabilities previously unexamined. Trenches were partially abandoned, artillery emplacements exposed, and communication lines disrupted by the speed and coordination of German movement. The collapse of defenses was not sudden or chaotic in the cinematic sense, but inevitable, an outcome of accumulated pressure, logistical strain, and the human limitations inherent in sustaining continuous operations under stress. French officers worked to re-establish cohesion. Units that had been separated during the retreat attempted to reconnect, repositioning infantry and coordinating artillery coverage across fragmented lines. Soldiers moved with caution through fields and roads now scarred by movement and battle. The psychological burden was palpable. The realization that strategic positions could no longer be held brought both frustration and resignation. Letters and diaries from this period reveal the quiet human experience of retreat and interplay of duty, fatigue, and the need for deliberate adaptation amidst circumstances slipping beyond immediate control. The German forces, by contrast, maintained a steady rhythm of advance. Infantry, engineers, and tanks moved in coordination, exploiting gaps in French lines as they appeared. Artillery units provided continuous support, while command maintained flexibility in responding to emerging opportunities. The advance was methodical, disciplined, and precise, each element functioning as part of a larger operational plan. Soldiers later described the experience as a sequence of careful movements, each step guided by the understanding that cumulative actions would shape outcomes more than any singular display of force civilian populations in the region experienced. The impact of the collapse with a mix of displacement and adaptation. Families fled along country roads, abandoning homes and possessions in response to the movement of armored columns and the uncertainty of military engagement. Villages emptied, leaving fields and streets marked by both the footprints of flight and the passage of troops. Letters and memoirs describe a pervasive tension, the familiar rhythm of daily life disrupted not by overt spectacle, but by the inexorable progression of armies through the landscape. Here, too, the inevitability of events shaped human behavior, emphasizing endurance and quiet resilience over dramatic response. French soldiers attempting to delay the German advance relied on limited rearguard actions. Small units deployed to obstruct roads, disrupt bridging points, and harass mechanized columns. These efforts, though earnest, were constrained by distance, exhaustion, and communication delays. Each encounter was minor in scale but cumulatively significant. Diaries recount moments of frustration, awareness of diminishing options, and the persistent need to maintain cohesion despite mounting pressure. The collapse of defenses emerged from the intersection of human effort, environmental factors, and operational coordination rather than from spectacular combat alone. German engineers, moving alongside advancing infantry, repaired damaged roads, secured river crossings, and ensured supply lines remained uninterrupted. Their efficiency underscored the broader discipline of the operation. The advance relied not merely on combat power, but on the integration of logistics, planning, and sustained human effort. Soldiers on both sides reflected later on the quiet determination required for these tasks. The cumulative weight of preparation, coordination, and vigilance determined the pace at which French lines eroded, illustrating that operational collapse is rarely sudden. It is a process shaped by multiple factors converging over time. Artillery exchanges, while present, were measured rather than cinematic. French guns targeted advancing columns, forcing minor adjustments, while German artillery provided covering fire to maintain momentum. Soldiers became attuned to these rhythms, observing, adjusting, and acting with both caution and discipline. The environment, the rolling fields, scattered villages, and hedgerows shaped movement and provided both opportunities and challenges. Decisions were never abstract. They were grounded in the human experience of observation, calculation, and action within a tangible landscape. By late afternoon, the erosion of French defensive capability was evident. Key positions along roads and fields had been bypassed or weakened, and artillery placements were increasingly vulnerable. Units retreated to secondary lines, attempting to regroup under pressure. Commanders faced the challenge of maintaining strategic coherence in an environment where speed, coordination, and human endurance dictated outcomes. Diaries from officers describe a mixture of resignation and professional focus. The acknowledgement that failure was incremental, inevitable, and rooted in the complex interplay of human, environmental, and operational factors. Civilians returned cautiously to villages that had been temporarily abandoned, encountering damage, occupied positions, or scattered equipment. Their observations recorded the subtle transformation of the landscape. Roads now marked by tracks of vehicles, fields disturbed by marching troops, and buildings bearing the first signs of occupation. The human cost of the collapse was not only military but social, affecting the rhythms of daily life in quiet, persistent ways. Letters from families reflect a combination of relief, fear, and the need to adapt, highlighting that the consequences of operational collapse extend beyond soldiers to encompass entire communities. The French retreat and the German advance together illustrate the inevitability of the outcome. Soldiers and officers on both sides were acutely aware that success or failure depended on the cumulative effects of small, disciplined actions executed under constrained conditions. Observers describe the interplay of preparation, observation, and adaptation as critical to understanding the progression of events. The collapse of defenses was thus not a moment of chaos, but the natural result of the measured pressures applied over several days, a reflection of strategy, human endurance, and circumstance converging in a historical context. As evening approached, the front lines had shifted decisively. French units were reorganizing in secondary positions, officers assessing the viability of continued defense, and soldiers navigating exhaustion, uncertainty, and the responsibility of sustaining cohesion. German forces had secured key objectives, their movements characterized by efficiency, coordination, and disciplined adaptation. The landscape itself, fields, rivers, roads, and villages, bore witness to the intersection of human activity and strategic consequence. The narrative emphasizes reflection over spectacle. The collapse is understood as a process shaped by inevitability, planning, and human endeavor, rather than by isolated heroic or catastrophic events. Chapter 3 thus provides a reflective and immersive view of how French defenses gradually gave way at Sedan. The audience sees the human, operational, and environmental factors converging to produce the outcome, understanding that the erosion of positions was the result of sustained pressure, coordinated action, and cumulative human decisions. The stage is now set for the next chapter, where the escalation of German momentum and the full consequences of the breach will become clear, emphasizing the interplay between human experience and historical inevitability. In the days following the fall of Sedan, the German army moved deliberately across the northern French countryside, exploiting the breach in French defenses with methodical precision. The advance was not marked by chaos or frenzied action. Instead, it unfolded as a series of interconnected, disciplined movements, each contributing to a larger operational outcome. Infantry and armored units traversed rolling fields, forests, and small villages, while engineers repaired roads and bridges, ensuring that supply lines remained continuous. The human dimension was central. Each soldier, officer, and engineer played a precise role within a coordinated strategy, aware that success depended on the aggregation of countless small, deliberate actions. French units, retreating from the Meuse, attempted to consolidate positions farther west. Artillery was repositioned, infantry redeployed, and communication lines restored as best as circumstances allowed. Commanders faced the challenge of coordinating dispersed units over increasingly fluid terrain, while soldiers managed the tension of continual movement under pressure. The psychological weight of retreat combined with the physical demands of endurance, creating a pervasive sense of strain. Diaries and letters describe quiet fatigue, a persistent awareness of vulnerability, and the need for careful observation at every turn. The collapse at Sedan had created an operational momentum that was now extending inexorably into the heart of France. The German advance, by contrast, emphasized rhythm, coordination, and logistical integrity. Columns of infantry followed armored units along established routes, while reconnaissance scouts probed ahead for obstacles or remaining pockets of resistance. Engineers repaired roads, constructed temporary bridges, and facilitated the movement of supplies and artillery. Officers maintained contact with higher command, ensuring that the tempo of the advance remained consistent with the broader operational plan. Soldiers later reflected on the quiet intensity of the movement, the repetitive tasks, the disciplined formations, and the cumulative effect of steady, unrelenting progress. Villages along the path of advance bore witness to both occupation and adaptation. Civilians fled or observed cautiously from hidden vantage points, noting the disciplined progress of German units. Houses were temporarily reproposed as billets or command posts, roads crowded with vehicles and troops, and fields marked by the tracks of armor and supply wagons. Yet amid this disruption, life persisted. Local populations adapted to the presence of soldiers, maintained basic routines, and sought shelter where possible. Letters and memoirs emphasize a dual awareness: the immediate human consequences of the advance and the broader inevitability of events unfolding according to operational pressures. French rearguard units engaged in limited actions to delay the German advance, targeting supply columns, obstructing roads, and harassing forward elements. These actions were isolated and tactical, slowing the enemy only modestly. Soldiers described the tension of these engagements, the careful observation of enemy movements, and the discipline required to execute maneuvers under pressure. At the same time, the advancing forces responded with adaptability, adjusting routes, providing suppressive fire, and ensuring that the momentum remained uninterrupted. The interplay of human decision-making, environmental constraints, and operational planning became increasingly evident as the advance continued. The geography of northern France played a subtle yet critical role. Rolling hills, forests, rivers, and small towns both facilitated and constrained movement. Engineers assessed road quality and bridge stability, adjusting routes accordingly. Infantry units adapted to cover and concealment, while armored columns maintained spacing and coordination to optimize both speed and protection. French observers noted the difficulty of predicting movement, constrained by terrain and the speed of enemy coordination. In this context, the advance across the heartland was not a spectacle, but a deliberate negotiation between human capability and environmental reality. By mid-afternoon, German forces had established footholds in several strategic towns, securing lines of communication and reinforcing supply routes. Engineers repaired damaged infrastructure, artillery was moved forward to support subsequent operations, and infantry units maintained vigilance along flanks. Soldiers on both sides were conscious of the cumulative effects of their actions. Fatigue, anticipation, and sustained discipline shaped daily experience as much as tactical engagements. The human narrative of endurance, adaptation, and quiet observation unfolded alongside operational developments, providing insight into how large-scale advances are realized through coordinated effort rather than dramatic acts alone. Civilians, when able, began to return cautiously to affected areas, encountering the realities of occupation, commandeered buildings, requisitioned supplies, and the physical markers of military movement. Letters and reports reflect the tension between fear and resilience, the recognition of altered routines, and the adaptation required to navigate an environment dominated by advancing armies. The advance across the heartland illustrates how warfare reshapes landscapes not only physically, but socially, transforming ordinary life through cumulative pressures rather than singular events. Artillery and air support provided additional layers of influence, though neither dominated the landscape in cinematic fashion. Instead, their use was calculated, precise, and consistent, reinforcing operational objectives without overshadowing the central human experience of movement, observation, and adaptation. Soldiers' accounts emphasize rhythm and discipline, noting that success relied on repeated, coordinated actions executed over hours and days. The human perception of space, timing, and consequence was as critical as the mechanical or tactical aspects of warfare. By evening, German forces had advanced steadily, consolidating positions, securing towns, and ensuring that supply and communication lines remained intact. French units had retreated further, reorganized where possible, and attempted to prepare secondary defensive positions. The landscape bore evidence of both movement and consequence. Roads marked by tire tracks and footprints, villages partially occupied or abandoned, and fields showing the imprint of armor and human passage. The advance across the heartland, though lacking dramatic spectacle, was a demonstration of operational discipline, human endurance, and the cumulative impact of strategic coordination. Chapter 4 underscores the inevitability of German momentum. Following Sedan, the narrative emphasizes the human and operational factors shaping the advance, the disciplined repetition of tasks, the adaptation to environmental and tactical conditions, and the cumulative effect of continuous pressure on the retreating French forces. Viewers gain a reflective understanding of how the breach at Sedan cascaded into broader operational consequences, altering both military positions and civilian life. The story progresses naturally, showing that the success of the advance depends on consistent human effort and coordination, not on singular heroic or catastrophic events. In the days following the German advance through Sedan and into the northern French heartland, the immediate battles receded, leaving behind a landscape that was at once familiar and irrevocably altered. Villages that had once hosted ordinary life now bore the quiet imprint of movement, occupation, and logistical activity. Roads were lined with tracks of vehicles, fields scarred by passing columns, and riverbanks marked by hastily constructed bridges. The human experience of this aftermath was subtle but profound. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike moved within a changed environment, interpreting the consequences of strategic decisions through lived experience rather than spectacle. For the French army, the collapse of defenses and retreat from Sedan required rapid adaptation. Units that remained intact were reorganized, communication lines partially restored, and artillery repositioned where feasible. Officers faced the challenge of maintaining morale and cohesion under conditions defined by both uncertainty and operational pressure. Soldiers recorded a mixture of fatigue, relief, and quiet determination. Letters and diaries reveal an awareness that their efforts were now constrained by the momentum of the German advance, emphasizing the human dimensions of endurance, decision-making, and resilience within circumstances largely beyond immediate control. German forces, having consolidated their positions, shifted focus to logistics, fortification, and maintaining the rhythm of advance. Engineers repaired roads and bridges damaged during the French retreat. Artillery units repositioned to cover newly occupied terrain, and infantry secured villages and strategic routes. Soldiers' accounts highlight the disciplined nature of these operations, steady, deliberate work aimed at sustaining momentum rather than seeking dramatic confrontation. The human effort was continuous, marked by repeated tasks, observation, and adjustment, demonstrating that strategic outcomes in war are as much the result of cumulative, methodical labor as they are of combat. Civilians confronted the consequences of military movement in multiple ways. Families returned cautiously to villages, encountering occupation, requisition supplies, and structural damage to homes and farms. Observers described a landscape at once familiar and foreign, shaped by the passage of armies and the imprint of conflict. Daily routines required adaptation. Children navigated fields and roads marked by tracks of vehicles. Households sought to re-establish order amidst disruption, and community life adjusted to new rhythms defined by both fear and resilience. The human experience of the aftermath emphasized endurance, reflection, and the quiet work of rebuilding alongside the persistent awareness of risk and change. Artillery positions, previously central to the collapse of defenses, remained active, but recalibrated for strategic oversight rather than immediate confrontation. Forward observers monitored terrain for movement, reporting to command units while maintaining vigilance over both civilian and military activity. Soldiers reflected on the transition from engagement to consolidation, noting the shift from acute tension to continuous, disciplined management of positions and resources. This phase of operations highlighted the interplay of human decision-making, observation, and adaptation, demonstrating that historical outcomes depend as much on sustained, coordinated effort as they do on isolated acts of combat. The Meuse River, once a site of crossing and contestation, now functioned as both a geographical and symbolic marker. Its banks bore the remnants of engineering work, tracks of movement, and the quiet traces of soldiers' labor. Civilians and military personnel alike interpreted the river as a boundary and a connector linking the past efforts of French defense with the operational success of German advance. Reflection on its role reveals the interaction of environmental factors with human decisions, emphasizing that the outcomes of conflict are inseparable from the terrain in which they occur. Within French units, the aftermath prompted assessment and reflection. Commanders evaluated both successes and failures, seeking to understand how preparation, positioning, and human endurance intersected with operational outcomes. Soldiers recounted moments of exhaustion, observation, and adaptation, noting the cumulative weight of repeated decisions under pressure. These narratives emphasize the human capacity for resilience, judgment, and professional commitment, even when confronted with outcomes shaped largely by strategic and environmental factors beyond their immediate control. German soldiers, in turn, engaged in similar reflection. Diaries and memoirs describe the quiet satisfaction of accomplishing objectives through methodical coordination, the recognition of human effort in sustaining operational tempo, and the awareness of responsibility toward maintaining momentum. The narrative is not one of triumphalism but of disciplined achievement, the recognition that strategic success derives from sustained, repeated actions executed with precision, and that the consequences of these actions extend beyond immediate military gain into both civilian life and the broader course of conflict. Civilians' narratives offer a complementary perspective. Letters describe cautious returns, efforts to salvage possessions, and the adaptation to new patterns of occupation. Observers noted both physical and psychological adjustments. Roads, homes, and fields bore witness to recent events, while communities engaged in quiet rebuilding, negotiation, and survival. The human experience of aftermath underscores that history is not solely a record of armies and strategy, but a living process experienced and interpreted by those whose lives intersect with conflict. By the end of this phase, the broader significance of Sedan became clear. The fall of the defensive line reshaped operational momentum, influenced morale, and determined subsequent strategic decisions. Yet the narrative is neither dramatic nor sensational. It is reflective, emphasizing inevitability and human agency within the constraints of circumstance. Soldiers, officers, and civilians experienced the consequences of movement, retreat, and advance not as isolated events, but as part of a continuous unfolding of cause and effect. The progression from preparation to collapse, from advance to aftermath, demonstrates the cumulative weight of human decisions, environmental conditions, and operational coordination. Chapter 5 therefore provides both conclusion and reflection. The audience is invited to consider how meticulous preparation, disciplined coordination, and human endurance shaped the course of Sedan and the broader campaign. The narrative emphasizes inevitability over spectacle, illustrating that outcomes in war emerge from the accumulation of deliberate, interconnected actions executed by individuals within complex circumstances. By tracing the continuity from initial preparation through advance and collapse to aftermath, viewers gain a comprehensive understanding of both operational and human dimensions, concluding the documentary with a reflective perspective on one of World War II's pivotal early moments.